Without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker for this afternoon. It probably needs no introduction. Most of us, if we're in the well business, we know this man. Adam Foster's with Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation with the enforcement sector, and deals a lot with the drillers, deals a lot with the groundwater conservation districts, and when we have well issues, he's usually the guy we're calling. So with that, please welcome Adam to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. One clarification, I'm actually not in enforcement. I'm in what used to be called compliance, and now it's called regulatory program management, but it's essentially the same duties. It's my job to make sure that water well drillers and pump installers are doing everything that they can to protect the groundwater in the state of Texas. So I do want to thank Bobby again, and I also want to thank TAG for inviting me up here. Originally, this talk was going to be geared more towards the commingling task force, but they met 2 weeks ago, and they didn't actually come up with any decisions. They decided to extend or basically form another work group and go over everything that was discussed in the meeting 2 weeks ago, and then hopefully meet in a couple months and then finally make a decision on the issue. So again, Tdlr, most of you guys know me. Most of you know about Tdlr, the program. But first and foremost, we're all about groundwater protection. Groundwater is a vital resource in the state of Texas. And the way that Tdlr contributes to that or helps protect it is that we make sure that water well drillers and pump installers are licensed and qualified to do what they're doing. They know what they're doing. They have the experience. We test them, make sure that they know what they need to know, at least on an entry-level basis. We also establish and enforce minimum well construction, well plugging, and pump installation standards. And I've highlighted minimum because many of you know on the state level, we have construction rules and siting rules that are applicable to the entire state. So we're not necessarily focused on a particular aquifer or a particular area. We have to make rules that can be used everywhere. On a local level, the GCD has full authority to go in and change the rules and make them more strict as far as construction and siting. It just depends on what y'all's board decides to do and go that direction. But you cannot make our rules less stringent. You can only make them more stringent. We also do the administration of the abandoned well notification enforcement program. Essentially, we'll get a call about an abandoned and/or deteriorated water well. We'll go out, we'll look at it. If it is abandoned and/or deteriorated, we'll contact the landowner or find out who the landowner is, contact them, and explain the situation and tell them they have 180 days to bring the well back into compliance or plug it. And then we also work with other state and federal agencies, sometimes local governments. We mainly work with GCDs, but we also work with Texas Water Development Board, TCEQ, and sometimes local municipalities when there's not a GCD in a particular county or a particular area. So most of you probably know this, but the first thing is that in the state of Texas, you need a license to drill a water well or to install pumps. One of the things that comes up a lot, and we get a lot of questions from GCDs about, is offering to act. So not only can they not do the work or drill water wells and install pumps, but they can't do any sort of activity that would be offering to act. And that means putting up billboards, having a business card in a local establishment. Any of that would be considered offering an act, and they can't do that unless they have a license with us, Tdlr. Within each license type, there's different endorsements. There's 4 endorsements for the pump installer and 5 for the driller. Just because a driller or a pump installer has a license with us doesn't mean they're necessarily qualified to install a certain type of pump or drill a certain type of well. So whenever a GCD has a driller in the area and say their driller wants to drill a certain type of well, it's good that you check with our database to see what endorsements they have. And here's a list of the endorsements. So for the pump installer, it's broken down into single phase, three-phase, turbine pumps, and then the last one is the windmill pump jacks and pumps, or hand pumps. And if the person holds, say, a P license for single phase, that's the only type of pump that individual can install. If they wanted to go to something bigger or install a windmill, they've got to go through the process of obtaining that endorsement before they can legally do that. Once they have all 4 endorsements, they get an I endorsement, which is a master installer. A lot of times you'll see older individuals or licensees, they'll have that because when we added the endorsements like 15 years ago, anybody who had a license before that was automatically given or grandfathered into the master program. Nowadays, you actually have to earn each individual endorsement type until you get that designation or that endorsement. On the driller side, it's broken down into 5. You have the W for water, M for monitoring wells, N for injection, D for dewatering, and then C, the last one is the closed loop geothermal. Obviously, the water well is going to be your domestic irrigation, rig supply, industrial type well, and then the others are actually, the way that they're constructed is different, and that's why we have the different endorsement type. Not many drillers have an N endorsement and a D endorsement. Primarily, the most endorsements that we see are the W and the M. But again, if they have the A endorsement down at the bottom, they're a master driller. So there's a couple exemptions to needing or required to have a license in the state of Texas. We get questions about this all the time from GCDs and GCD staff. The first one is if a person is drilling in the backfill of an underground storage tank and the well is no more than 20 feet in depth, they don't need a license. Any person who drills environmental auger soil boring and it's no more than 10 feet, they don't need a license. Any person who drills a water well or sets a pump on their own property, on their own well, they don't need a license. They still have to follow all the construction rules and siting rules that we have and that y'all have, and any paperwork that's required. Say if you require a permit or a registration, all that is still required. They just don't need a license to drill on their own property. And then also, this is a relatively new one that's come up, is the dewatering well. If the well is intended for construction, bridge, drainage, or underground utility project, then they don't need a license to drill a dewatering well for those things. So we have the 2 ways to obtain the qualifications to get a license in the state of Texas. One is an unlicensed assistant, and the other one is the registered apprentice program. They're very different in the way that what the supervision is from the licensee. With an unlicensed assistant, basically that person is just there to learn directly from the licensee. The licensee has to be there at all times on site. They can't leave for any amount of time. If they do, they've got to shut down the rig or shut down the operation. They're not responsible for anything that happens. So if something happens during the course of drilling a well or setting a pump, it's a violation of our rules or your rules. It's not on that unlicensed person. It's on the licensee himself. So it's more of an incentive for that licensee to actually be present when the work is being done. And then really importantly, they can't contract, bid, or do any sort of money collection with customers or potential customers. That all needs to be done through the licensee. Sometimes you have large drilling companies or pump installer companies. They've got 3 or 4 licensees working under them, and then they have somebody in-house that does all the bidding or the contracting. Technically, that person, if they're communicating with the public or communicating with potential customers, they need to be licensed. So just keep an eye on that when you're talking to these companies. Make sure that they're actually licensed. With the licensed apprentice, it's actually a license type that we have. So they apply for it. There's no pre-qualifications. They don't need to have anything. Really, all they need is for a licensee to sponsor them. The sponsoring process is basically they fill out the form, they explain in detail how they want the apprenticeships program to go, any milestones or qualifications they want to see met in that 2-year period. So with the actual having a license, is a little more authority that they have. They can pretty much act on behalf of the licensee as long as that licensee is given that authority under their license. They are responsible for any violations or the work that they do. So if they mess up, it's on them. And then they can work with, or they can talk to potential landowners or potential well owners and say, yeah, we can do this, or yeah, we can do that. They have the authority. Also with the apprentice, they actually have to take the 1-hour rules and regs every year to renew that license. They don't have to take it to get it, but they do have to take it to renew their license. So if you guys are ever out in the field and you come across a rig that's running, if you check to make sure that either they're a licensee or they're a part of the apprentice program. If they're not, then obviously the rig needs to be shut down until some licensee can get there. Now we're going to talk about construction standards. Here's an example. This is your basically minimum construction. The well's not located anywhere near any potential source of contamination. You're not worried about commingling or drilling through injurious water. We only require, in these circumstances, a minimum of 10 feet of annular seal, okay? Other states, they require a lot more, but at the state of Texas, we only require the 10-foot rule. The borehole must be 3 inches greater in diameter than the outside diameter of the casing. The reason that we have that rule is because studies have shown that you can't properly gravel pack and or seal the annular space of the well if you don't have that 3 inches around the casing. A lot of times you can't even get a trimming tube down an annular space if you don't have the 3 inches. So you need to have at least 3 inches around the casing. We recommend on a shallow superficial aquifer well, 10 feet of annular seal above the production zone or above the gravel pack, but it's only recommended. And then this example, we have a surface slab. So if any well in the state of Texas, if it has PVC casing, it's required to have a surface completion on it. It can either be a surface slab or it can be a surface sleeve. If it's steel case, then a surface completion is not required. But there needs to be something on there if it is PVC case to protect that casing. If you drill the well or you construct the well to those specifications, you can be 50 feet away from the property line, 50 feet from a watertight line septic tank or drain field, or septic tank, 100 feet from I can't even read that, it's kind of weird, a dry litter poultry facility or a drain field, and then 150 feet away from any other potential source of contamination. Now, if you do the alternate annular seal, you can be 5 feet away from the property line, and then 50 feet away from any other potential source of contamination, whatever it is. Anything that could potentially affect the quality of groundwater in an area, you can be more than 50 feet away from that. If you need to encroach closer to 50 feet, then you have to apply for a variance, or the driller has to apply for a variance, and they have to put in detail what the situation is and why they can't place the well more than 50 feet away from a potential source of contamination. Now, when it comes to siting, again, you as GCDs, y'all can make the distance reductions closer than these distances. However, these are real minimums, so I wouldn't suggest going out and saying you can put a well closer than that, than the potential source of contamination. And we talked about the annular seal. If you do the distance reduction, then you have to pressure grout the annular space to 100 feet or to the top of the production zone, whichever is less. So if it's 50 feet to water, the driller must seal up from 50 foot. If it's 150 feet to water, they've got to seal the top 100 feet. But it's got to be pressure grouted. If you just do the minimum 10 feet, then the driller can just basically mix the concrete with water or mix the bentonite with water and dump it down the annular space. But anything more than that, it's got to be pressure grouted. Commingling. In the state of Texas right now, the way it is under no circumstance can you allow a well to basically be completed in multiple zones or multiple aquifers, or if the water quality in those zones are different, okay? This is a pretty big problem, as many of you guys know, especially in the Carrizo-Wilcox area. I mean, all along the span of the aquifers, West Texas, the Permian Basin. This is a big issue. A lot of times the driller isn't necessarily aware of the fact that he's drilling through multiple aquifers and completing it in multiple aquifers. Sometimes they are aware. Whenever I talk to drillers, and I stress in CE courses that they need to get with the district. If you're drilling in an area that you don't know about or you haven't drilled before, it's really important not just to know the lithology, but also to just build that relationship with the districts. It'll save you a lot of headache down the line if you go and talk to them and say, hey, I'm drilling in this area, how should I construct the well? Not only that, but y'all might have different rules than the state. Here's an example that the driller drilled through an injurious water zone or a zone that has different quality. They've got to seal off that zone. They've got to pressure grout the zone, and they can use cement or they can use bentonite. If they use cement or if they use bentonite, the chlorides can't be above 1,500 milligrams per liter or hydrocarbons are present. And when the water quality is like that, the bentonite doesn't seal properly, doesn't swell properly, and you don't get an actual seal, and you can basically have a ruined well because it wasn't properly done. So at least in those intervals, if you have that water quality, you've got to use cement. Here's an example where the driller drilled too deep. This happens all the time. Sometimes they're aware of it, sometimes they're not. We don't have any rules about testing the water, so this probably happens more often than not, where they actually drilled too far into some bad water. Salt water's denser than fresh water, goes down to the bottom, it sits there, and the driller may not be even aware that they're doing this. But if they do it and they are aware of it, then they've got to seal off that zone before they can complete the well in the freshwater zone above it. Here's an example of a well that's actually drilled to produce from a bad water zone or injurious water zone, however you want to define it. I would say in the past 3 or 4 years, these are becoming a lot more common, especially in oil and gas areas where the user isn't necessarily concerned about the quantity or the quality of water. They just want a bunch of water. So in the Permian Basin, again, all along the Eagle Ford Shale or the Carrizo-Wilcox, you're seeing these types of wells. The important thing is, if there's any fresh water, any amount whatsoever, that water is being protected, they need to seal it off, okay? If you guys are out there, you're looking at well reports, you see this happening, we need to be notified if they're not sealing off those zones, because we want to, again, protect the fresh water. A couple of things that we see a lot with construction materials is on a domestic well or an irrigation well, the driller is required to install a manufactured screen and choose the correct slot size to prevent any sand or sediment from getting in the well. So an industrial well, that doesn't really apply, any of the other wells types, but they need to do their best to prevent sand from getting in the well. Now we all know that's, anybody's dealt with water wells, it's almost nearly impossible to get a sand-free well. And a lot of times when a landowner or well owner contacts us about sand in their well, the first thing we do is ask when the well was drilled and if they've pumped the well, okay? There's always going to be some residual sediment, whether it's mud or leftover residue from the drilling process, whatever it is, there's going to be some stuff in there. But saying that, or being how it is, if you're in an area where you're completing the well in a sandy or silty area, the driller needs to gravel pack and choose a correct slot size. Don't do an open hole or what they call an ungravel packed well. They need to do what they can to prevent it. They also have to follow the manufacturer's recommended pump sizing and wire specifications when installing pumps. This is a big issue. A lot of times pump installers won't use the correct wire type, or they're hooking it up to the panel incorrectly. As licensees, they're not required to have electrician's license, but they're still required to do everything to the National Electric Code because of this rule right here, because they have to follow the manufactured spec. Anytime you look at any of those handouts that are given when you buy a pump, they say follow the National Electric Code, okay? So if y'all are out there and y'all see, or somebody complains about them using, inside wire or UL wire or whatever it is, it needs to be fixed. And then they also have to choose the correct hydraulic collapse pressure when installing the casing. This is going to be more important when you're talking about deeper wells where there's a lot of head in the well. They need to go with a thicker casing or switch to stainless steel or steel cased. Or now we actually have the fiberglass casing. That's an approved material now. Well reports. So anytime the bit goes in the ground, the driller is required to submit a well report to you guys, okay? Or, I'm sorry, to us. They've got 60 days to do it. It's got to be legible. It's got to be accurate. It's got to have the correct GPS coordinates. I really stress this when I talk to drillers about with today's technology, there's no excuse for not having the correct GPS. If they can't get it in the field, they can go back to their offices, look on Google Maps, Google Earth, any of those mapping programs. They can find the correct GPS. They can get with the district to help, find them or to locate the correct GPS coordinates. As we just saw in the previous talks, people are actually using that data, whether they know it or not. So, that information needs to be accurate. And if you're saying a well's, 5 miles over, if somebody starts using that data, it's going to mess up their interpretation. So it needs to be accurate. Also, from a district standpoint, y'all are required to get the well itself. And sometimes y'all do inspections, or maybe you had sited it before the well was even drilled. If you come across well reports that don't have the correct GPS on them, we really need to know about it, and that way we can get it corrected in the database. Even if you do it like once a month and you just keep a spreadsheet or something like that, and at the end of the month you send it to us. Whatever it is, you don't have to do it like on an individual well basis. And then the plugging reports, it's pretty much the same with the well reports, except they have 30 days to get it into us. But they need to give a copy to you guys, and they need to give a copy to the landowner. Capping wells, this is a big deal, especially in like the Panhandle and west parts of Texas where you have uncapped wells. The way that the rule is if it's an existing well, it's the responsibility of the landowner to cap the well, okay? And that is, if it is not an abandoned well, it's not a deteriorated well, it's their responsibility to do it, to cap it. If it's a newly drilled well and the pump hasn't been set, a lot of times drillers don't have the dual license, so they're only responsible for drilling the well. And it could be months and months or sometimes even years before a pump is installed in the well. So in that interim, it needs to be capped. And then finally, if a pump installer pulls a pump and has to leave the site for any amount of time, it's their responsibility to properly cap that well. Even if they're just going to lunch, you never know what could come by, or kids could come by, dump some stuff down in there, an animal could come by. It's just really important that they properly cap the wells. And here's an example of an improperly capped one. We see all sorts of stuff. A lot of times it's tape, sometimes it's buckets. None of that. It has to be if it's a PVC cased well, it needs to have a PVC cap on it. It doesn't have to be glued on there. A lot of times what I'll see is caps, and then they actually screw in the cap on there, and that way it's not really easily removed. Test wells, dry holes. This comes up quite a bit. We get a lot of calls from districts about this. If a driller drills a test hole, if they're exploring for groundwater, they can't just leave it how it is indefinitely, okay? They've got 6 months from completing the well to make a decision about what they're going to do. And this happens a lot, you know. A landowner will have a well drilled and they want, you know, 15 gallons per minute, and the driller drills them a well and it's only producing 8. And so there's kind of this question, well, what do we do? Should we complete the well? Should we plug the well? That's fine. We understand that, you know, you need some time to make the decision, but you can't just leave it like that with the intent of never coming back. I got a call from a manager in the Panhandle a couple weeks ago, and he said it was pretty much common practice for drillers to drill water wells, and if they didn't hit any water, just to move on. And you can't do that. Yes, the well might fill in at some point, but it could be hundreds of years before it does that. And even then, you know, you're drilling through thousands and millions of years of rock and dirt, and it's hard, it's compact. Just filling it in on its own is not going to give that level of protection that, you know, before the well was drilled. So it needs to be properly plugged. If a driller drills a dry hole, meaning they don't hit a single drop of water, they can backfill with the cuttings to plug the well. But if they hit any amount of water whatsoever, I mean, single drop of water, then the well needs to be plugged with bentonite or cement, like we'll talk about here in a minute. Again, Tdlr is tasked with abandoned and deteriorated wells. So the law states that once we've identified an abandoned and or deteriorated water well, that we give the landowner 180 days to fix it, okay? By definition, a deteriorated well is a well that, because of its condition, will cause or is likely to cause pollution to any groundwater in the state of Texas, okay? So this goes for open annulus, holes in the casing, commingling, anything that can affect the quality of groundwater around that well. If it's from the well itself and the construction of the well's considered a deteriorated water well. An abandoned water well is basically just a well that's not in use. You know, a well that's not in use can be capped as long as it's not a deteriorated water well. So when we go out, we inspect these things, we take a little check sheet with us, you know, we determine, you know, we go through the list and see if it is abandoned and or deteriorated. Usually when it's an abandoned well, we just get them to cap it. We notify the GCD and say, hey, we've got this well on the radar. You might want to, you know, keep an eye on it. It could at some point turn into a deteriorated water well. But once it does become a deteriorated water well, then it needs to be fixed or plugged. The proper way to plug a water well, the first thing is you got to remove everything at the surface. You got to remove the pump, the wiring, the drop pipe. You got to remove as much casing as possible. Now, depending on the construction of the well, you know, it's impossible to remove any of the casing, but the driller's got to at least attempt to remove as much as he can. Now, if there's an open annulus in the well, the driller needs to do everything they can to perf the casing and actually get grout and squeeze it out of the inside of the casing into the annular space. If a driller or a pump installer can't remove the pump, say it's stuck or the casing broke off and they can't get it past the break, they need to apply for a variance to actually plug that well. What we say is they got to try to push the pump to the bottom and then plug from the top of the pump on up. And sometimes they can't push it down to the bottom, but we at least need to know about that. And that's basically what the variance process is to keep track of that stuff. And so if that plugged well in the future is like the source of a contamination, then we can go back and we say, well, we allowed them to plug it that way without removing the pump. But they still have to try to remove the pump. And then for those of you guys that have large diameter wells in your area, there's probably tens of thousands of those all around the state of Texas. If a landowner does have one of those and comes across it, sometimes, you know, they'll remove a house and they'll find a large hand dug well underneath the house, or they're clearing a field and they'll find one there. A lot of times they're not, they don't know about them before that happens. Those types of wells, they can be plugged by filling in with local dirt, so it's a lot cheaper than, having to use bentonite or cement. And then for those of you guys that want to file a complaint, there's two ways of doing it. You can do it online, and there's a website or the web address to file the complaint. It can either be under an unlicensed person or like an actual construction violation or siting violation. So you can do it online, or you can always call us and we can take care of the complaint. Either way, whatever you guys want to do. And I will leave that with our contact information. For those of you guys that know me, I travel the state. Whenever I'm out in the field, I like to swing by GCDs just to see what's going on, see what I can do to help if there's a situation going on. We also, many of you guys know that we do training, so if you have field staff that are going out and looking at wells, we can actually train staff members and office staff, what to look for violations, reading well reports, that type of stuff. So if y'all are interested in doing that, come talk to me afterwards or come to our booth and we can absolutely set that up. So thanks, guys.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, so for
I think we have some questions.
we have questions.
How do you treat it? What do you think of cathodic protection well?
The question was about cathodic protection wells. We don't regulate those because they're not actually exploring for water. So by definition, of water wells, you're exploring for water. So that's the only type of wells that we regulate. So if it's a geotechnical well, even if they drill 500 feet, they're not technically exploring for water, so that doesn't fall under our jurisdiction. Gotcha. A lot of times those cathodic wells are real shallow too.
Appreciate it. Now, in respect of time, so we can keep the program on schedule. Adam is available. They are a sponsor. They do have a booth out in front. So if y'all have any questions for Adam, feel free to either catch him afterwards or catch him out at the booth.